Okay, we're going to get started. Hello and welcome to this Institute for Government event on preparing for future challenges, how government can best use science. It's very good to be back at the first in-person conference for a couple of years, indeed the first since this government was elected, a good moment to reflect on what's been an extraordinary period we've just been through and the challenges ahead for the government and for the country. My name's Tom Sasse. I'm an Associate Director at the Institute for Government. I lead our work on policy making. So this is a government that likes to talk about science, not just being led by it, but also, to quote the 2019 manifesto, creating a vibrant science-based economy post-Brexit, indeed of becoming a science superpower. British science played a prominent role in the global response to COVID-19. We had some very big successes, as you all know, from the vaccine to diagnostics. But the pandemic also exposed problems with the way that government uses science, as well as a wider lack of resilience. So the purpose of this panel is to have a fairly broad discussion about the role of science in the UK, how government draws it in and applies it in what it does, and how we can be better prepared to face future challenges. We've got a great panel to talk about all of that. Greg Clark is chair of the Science and Technology Committee. He served as business secretary between 2016 and 2019, developing an industrial strategy that majored on the role of science, and he held several other ministerial roles before that, including Science Minister. He's been at the forefront of efforts in Parliament to scrutinise the way that government's been using science advice in the way it's handled COVID. Sir Mark Walport has held key positions at the top of UK science over several decades. After a career as a professor of medicine at Imperial, he was director of the Wellcome Trust, then of course government chief scientific advisor from 2013 to 2017, and then the first CEO of UK Research and Innovation from 2018 until last year. And he's also of course been a key member of the SAGE Advisory Committee, often on our airwaves over the last 20 months or so. Professor Ian Walmsley is Provost at Imperial College London, and his research focuses on optical science and technology. He was the director of the Networked Quantum Information Technology Hub, and he's also a member of the leadership team and management board of the Quantum Computing and Simulation Hub. He's a fellow of the Royal Society, the Optical Society, and the American Physical Society, and the Institute of Physics. And Kath Haddon is a senior fellow at the Institute for Government and our resident historian, expert on the Constitution and author of some of our work on science advice and the way governments used it during the pandemic. Polly Toynbee unfortunately wasn't able to join us, but sent her apologies. So I'm going to start by asking my panel a few questions and having a bit of a short discussion. We'll then have around 25 minutes or so for questions from you. We'll be recording this event and live tweeting it at IFG Cons 21. And the event is, of course, on the record. We're not expecting any fire alarms. If you do hear an alarm, then Penny at the back will be directing you on what to do. And we're going to aim to wrap up at about 2:15. Greg's going to leave us a bit earlier than that at 2. Lastly, we're very grateful to Imperial College London and the Royal Society, who've each played their own role over the last 18 months for supporting this event. So, Greg, the UK has one of the highest death tolls from COVID in the world. What are the lessons from COVID, including how government uses science, and how confident are you that the government is learning them?
Well, thank you, Sean. The first thing to say is that I don't think we can even make that assessment of whether we have one of the worst death tolls in the world, because as is evident, the pandemic is not over, and there are two problems with that. One is that different countries measure deaths from COVID in different ways, and the other thing is that in the successive waves, the performance, as it were, of a country that was thought to have done well in the first wave is not necessarily translated into subsequent waves, leading to big questions for policy, as we see in New Zealand just this week. So actually, and I'm sure the Institute will be placing its beady eye on these comparisons, because it is important, but I don't think we can give a definitive judgment on that yet. I think the good news is that the pandemic, for all the horrors of it, and no one would want to to experience it, it has proved an occasion in which the public have probably heard more from scientists and more directly from scientists than at any time in my lifetime. And I think that's a good thing, because as the Institute does across the board, you have experts in different subject areas who share their advice, share their knowledge. And the fact that we have had a great public appetite, the proceedings of the committee that I chair have had viewing figures beyond anything that we've previously experienced, because people are interested in the detail, understanding it. So I think that is positive for science if we are to continue to include the public in that. The report of the joint inquiry that my committee, the Science and Technology Committee, and the Health and Social Care Committee undertook is going to be published imminently, and so it would be wrong for me to talk about too many of the conclusions on this. Suffice to say this, and this is something that the committee has written about and wrote to the Prime Minister about and wrote to Sir Patrick Vallance about early in the pandemic, which was that if you are to take scientific advice and you are to give a prominence to scientific advice, then we all know that the way that science proceeds is through contest, through disputation, through publication. And sometimes people refer to the science. I think it's now increasingly understood that there isn't the science. There are sciencers, and there are many scientists. And again, I think knowing that, the transparency of deliberation, and in particular the basis on which advice is given, I think is very important. We're not contracting out to people just to tell us what to do without the public having any interest in why they're saying that. We're very interested in it. And so the inherited structures of SAGE, and Mark and I in government worked on through SAGE on a number of different times, I think did need revising in response to the pandemic. The membership of SAGE, you might recall, was secret at first. The minutes were not published. They would be published after the end of the emergency. And the papers on which scientific advice were based were not published. So we had some sessions of our inquiry about that and wrote to the Prime Minister and Sir Patrick Vallance to say, we think you can be self-confident about being open, and this won't lead to some sort of collapse in confidence. The exposure that actually there are different views is something that people know anyway, and they're perhaps more likely to be skeptical and doubtful if they can't see the basis of the advice. And so I should put on record my acknowledgement of Sir Patrick Vallance's role in changing those inherited procedures, so that we do now know who's on SAGE, we know what the minutes of the meetings are, and we know the papers on which they take decisions. So that is, I think, an example of what our overall inquiry seeks to do. Obviously, it has taken place, and the report will take place sometime before the full public inquiry, but there are lessons to be learned on the way, and I think it would be wrong to simply defer them to the time of the look back when it's all over, as it were, if it ever is. It's to learn lessons that can be applied, and I think that's a good example of lessons that were applied successfully. We might come on to some others that could have been applied on the way but weren't, and we need to keep pushing that.
Do you think the public inquiry is sort of, such as the plans are developing, is proceeding with sufficient urgency?
Yes, so I agree with the government's decision on this, that we should have a very comprehensive review of everything from beginning to end. I mean, Mark and others will no doubt say that COVID is going to be around in some form or another, but once we feel that we are over the emergency phase of it, I think that's the time to do it. for a number of reasons. One is that a lot of the decision makers are still immersed in decision making at the moment, and to respond comprehensively to a very thorough inquiry will take and should take quite a deal of their time. And the other thing is, as I said right at the beginning, we're not in a position that we, I think, can reliably say, it's over now and it's time to look back. So I think that's the right call, but to kind of blow the joint trumpet of my committee and the Health and Social Care Committee, there clearly is a role for an interim lessons learned report, and that's what we've tried to do.
And we very much look forward to sort of seeing the detail of the recommendations in that. We at the IFG certainly found some of your reports during the pandemic itself very helpful. Without sort of setting out those details, do you have sort of confidence that there is appetite within government to sort of make some of these changes to learn these lessons? Do you see that happening before we just move on?
Well, I hope so. I wouldn't take it for granted. There's examples that might make one optimistic. So the one that I gave, the greater transparency of advice. But there are other examples. If I think of the test and trace operation, we in the spring said that when we went into the summer and there was going to be something predictable lull in the intensity of the pandemic, that should be an occasion to really build up testing capacity. That didn't happen, certainly to the degree that was appropriate. And this time last year, we had a big problem of very delayed test results, which, as everyone here knows, time is critical in these things. So sometimes the government has been willing to take advice and apply those lessons, offered in the spirit of being constructive, but sometimes, for whatever reason, it's proved resistant to that, and that may have to do with things that the IFG studies as to how advice is acted upon.
Yeah, brilliant. Mark, welcome any reflections on the sort of issues that Greg set out there with the management of the pandemic, but I wonder if you could also broaden this out for us, and we hear this term science superpower bandied around.
Yeah.
What does the UK need to do to become one?
Okay, thank you. Well, the first thing to say is that our modern world is absolutely shaped by science and its applications through engineering and technology. And it is all the sciences and the social sciences and actually the arts and humanities. So, and what we need to do, I think, is to use it more for preparedness. And so, if you look at a very concrete example, which is the development of the vaccine for COVID by now dead Sarah Gilbert, that actually started, firstly, with a great deal of support for immunologists, people who could understand the immune system and its response in infectious diseases. But in 2015, using £110 million of ODA funding, a vaccine network was set up, recognising the fact that coronaviruses did pose a threat to the human population. So the idea, as it were, that coronaviruses weren't thought about is completely wrong. And it was because Sarah Gilbert and her colleagues in Oxford had been preparing a vaccine for the MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory System coronavirus, which actually, if that becomes a pandemic, knocks this one into a cocked hat, actually. It's a very, very dangerous virus indeed. And so actually using science for an insurance policy is really critical. And that insurance policy takes two forms. It takes the people that are trained as researchers, as engineers and technologists, but it also looks at the important areas. And so my reflection is that when you look at the opportunities and also the threats, the environmental threats, climate, biodiversity, the enormous amount of waste that more than 7 billion people on the planet are producing, then at the end of the day, the solutions for this are going to come from discovering new knowledge and actually applying it. And I think that it's inevitable that we look through the lens of a national emergency at the moment, and it, for R0 to become a household word, as it were, and people knowing about reproduction numbers of viruses, is extraordinary. And I think it is, in that sense, I think science is in the public consciousness in a way that it hasn't been for many, many years, actually. But countries in general are very good at managing the last emergency. And what we're not good at is paying the insurance policy to actually prevent the next one from happening. And so one reflection that I would have on test and trace is that, or track and trace, that rich countries had forgotten about infectious diseases. The focus of public health had switched from infectious disease to chronic disease. And this is actually, if there's one lesson to learn, it's a failure of paying the insurance policy of better public health. And it was in the 19th century that John Snow discovered the route by which cholera was transmitted through or a fecal route with sewage. But we effectively took away a lot of the test and trace facilities, the diagnostic facilities of surveillance for infection. And we've done this over decades. This isn't something that's happened in the last 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. And so I think that what we need to do is, the UK has an extremely good national risk register. But what we need to do, as in any good organisation, use the risk register to manage and prevent things from happening. And I think that's what we consistently fail. So if we're going to use science better, then I think we have to use it to be prepared and actually learn from one of the successes, which is that we did have the UK vaccine network. And of course, Greg will remember that as part of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, we recognised there was a shortage of vaccine manufacturing facilities. And so something called the Vaccine Manufacturing Innovation Centre was set up and funded, but ran foul of planning permission for about 3 years. I think it's fair to say the planning was solved quite quickly at the beginning of last year, but I mean, frankly, too late. And I think that the Vaccine Task Force has got to be commended for actually creating. It has been an extraordinary effort in logistics. And again, I think that what science tells you is actually a lot about complex systems, about cascading failures. And what we're seeing at the moment is the great interconnectedness of modern infrastructure, where we've become more efficient but less resilient. And so you see that gas prices go up, it becomes uneconomic to make fertilizer, and you suddenly lose your CO2 stream, which was important for stunning animals for killing them humanely, so you potentially can't slaughter pigs and chickens. And what's more, it's carbon dioxide in the packaging that's used to stop it going off in our fridges. And this is an example of a complex cascading failure. In terms of the science of superpower, I'm afraid power requires fuel. And the fuel in this case is people and money. And the UK R&D is stubbornly stuck at 1.74% of GDP. The government has had a target to take it up to 2.4% for quite a long time now, and we are not making progress towards that. There was a commitment to increase R&D funding to 22 billion, and I think we're all waiting with bated breath to see what's in the spending review. But we are falling far behind similar countries. So France has just increased its the funding for its national research institution by threefold. The Americans are pouring another $250 billion into research. And frankly, if you look at our economy and you look at all the economic opportunities, this industrial revolution, which is largely IT, but also clever devices, and Ian can talk more about that, depends on us being a superpower. And frankly, we will not be a superpower if we don't provide the fuel. So it needs the resources. So I think one wouldn't give I think it's worrying on that front. It's one thing to talk about it, but the rhetoric has got to be matched by the reality.
Brilliant. Very IFG question here, but apologies for that. Do you think the structures in government need to change in response to what we've... I mean, so people have talked about using SAGE in a slightly different way in a future crisis, but interestingly, we've also seen this new Office for Science Technology Strategy, I think it's called. So it's a reshuffling in the Cabinet Office.
Yes, well, I think in principle the office is a good idea, but the question is its connectivity. And it's one thing to have an office, the question is what it will actually do. I mean, the machinery of government we have, this is again an IFG point, goes back to Haldane's report in 1918. We still have substantially the same structure. But Haldane said one very important thing. He said that he thought the government would work better if it took account of evidence. And that was by far and away the most sensible thing he said in what is a beautiful, very thin report that covers the whole machinery of government. But I think that, again, it's the customer function for science that really matters. And people think that from the outside world that if they drop a very clever report onto a minister's desk, stuff will happen. But it's a question actually of making sure that there is a good customer function. And that applies in both the civil service and also in government itself. And so having science at the central government, it was there before under William Waldegrave. Science was actually in the Cabinet Office. And then there was a reshuffle, I think, when Michael Heseltine came to Department for Trade, as it was at the time, and it sort of moved back. There isn't necessarily a right answer to where science is, but I think the important thing is that although it's in bays, there is no part of government where science doesn't matter. And I would just make the point that the job of people like me is to provide the evidence. It's not the job of the scientists to make the policies. And I think that's sometimes where there is a misperception as to the role of science advice.
Yeah. And just on your comments about the sort of fuel needed for becoming a science superpower, as well as the sort of 2.4% point, is there also a link here to levelling up? Because one thing we hear a lot about is that actually our science base is too narrow, too dominated by London, Oxford and Cambridge, we're sort of very strong in some areas but not others. Do we need to see science as sort of having a key role in this levelling up vision, which we're hearing so much about at this conference?
Well, because it's part of the economy of the country and is so pervasive, then it's important in every part of the country. But it is, I think, sometimes overdone. Manchester has a great university. There are great universities distributed around the country. But if you look at, if you want to look at science and the economy, look at the semiconductor cluster in South Wales. And I think the challenge here isn't, as it were, trying to create a nanotechnology businesses in every part of the country. It is actually to look around and see where the strengths are and to build on those. And there are great strengths across the country, actually. But each area, in some senses, has got to form its own strategy. Around Warwick, there's the Warwick manufacturing centre, which both Greg and I are involved with. So I think, yes, it's a very important part of levelling up. And I wouldn't for a second pretend that there's not more to be done. But I think that sciences are very much a part of the story of levelling up. And that does go with skills. And I think there is another side of skills, which I think that the UK has this sort of block on recognising the power of sort of technological skills, which in Germany are very, very highly prized indeed. And so if your child goes to a technological college, that is as highly valued as going to a more traditional academic university. And I think that we need skills at every level.
Yeah. Okay. Ian, how's the pandemic been for scientists trying to engage with government and also communicate with the public?
I think the pandemic has rehabilitated expertise as a guide to making decisions in the public domain, and as a result has elevated some scientists to quite prominent public figures, even TV stars. And I think they've done that by being able to combine both the rigor of being able to present evidence clearly, but also empathy for the subject that they are and the people that they're engaging with. And beyond that, I think developing a level of trust in what that advice looks like. And that, I think, is a key thing going forward, is how do we ensure that science remains a trustworthy public discourse? You've heard from Greg and Mark, of course, about the need for transparency in how science is scrutinized. I think that is absolutely right. We definitely need to maintain the focus on that. Second, I think we have to be clear that there is no unique output from science. There is perspectives on what the evidence gives us to conclude. And I think we have to understand that variance and use that as part of the discourse. So making sure that there's no internecine fighting to say this is right, this is wrong is quite important. So that's, I think, how I think we build trust. And I hope that we can continue to remain in the public eye for that. Then I think that in terms of engagement with government, you've heard a bit about the structures, SAGE particularly, the Joint Committee on Vaccines and Immunology, etc. I think there's quite a lot of helpful structure, but Mark will know better. The Science Advisory Network within government, I think, is a very good way for that information to be embedded right at the heart of policy making. But there's no doubt that we can use more to connect a wider range of scientists across a wider range of disciplines to a wider range of government actors. One might ask, for example, within UKRI and the research councils, there are fantastic networks out to whatever's the cutting edge is, all the domains of experts? How do we draw on an entity that the government has already established to help inform policy making even more? So, for the future, Mark has pointed out this tension between efficiency and resilience. Resilience is about redundancy, and how does one make a strong case for having that redundancy in the system so that you are ready for what comes in the future? And technology is going to be at the basis of all the big societal transformations in the future, whether, as you've heard, from climate change, from food resilience, from pervasive information technologies, whether that's AI or quantum computing. I thought I'd give that a plug right here. I think a second point, Mark's also noted this idea of a fuel. I would take the idea of an ideas ecosystem. How do you generate ideas, test them out, move them from the ones that are fruitful now? How do you move those to innovation? How do you put them into a new technology sector? How do you grow jobs and grow economy through those? I think part of that is also the idea that you must be globally connected. So for me, science superpower and global Britain are absolutely intertwined. You need to have that exchange of ideas to really test them out as rapidly as possible, and the multiple different perspectives that you get from different people looking at them is absolutely crucial. And then building on that to get the innovation ecosystem to move them to a point where they can become new commercial and other products, I think is the next piece that we need to work on too.
Just on the first part of that, some of your scientists at Imperial have been under intense scrutiny really through the pandemic. You think of particularly people like Neil Ferguson, and some of sort of heard him on the radio talking about the abuse he'd received, and some of the, have you had to sort of rethink how you support your academics and your scientists to sort of play some of these very public, very prominent roles?
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. Scientists are humans too, and it's sometimes easy to forget that. So it's certainly the case that scientists need to understand how they can convey the messages that they're carrying, and institutions like ours need to understand how we can better support and train individuals to do that. So the Science Communication Media Center, I think, has been very good. We have our own science communication master's program at Imperial. And various ways like that in which we can help support our scientists.
Yeah, and on the point of being globally connected, we've seen some progress, some ideas of sort of fast track visas, things like this. I mean, do you think we are open enough to sort of bring in the sort of talent that we need and keep it here?
Yeah, I think the Global Visa Program has been a really good idea. I think the other end of it, of course, is bringing in young people who are going to be contributing in the future. So that's also around students, for example, who are sort of the engine of the new sector.
Brilliant. Kath, I wonder if you could provide us with a bit of historical context. Why is sort of using science and government quite difficult, and actually talk us through what you found in the report we did on science advice during the pandemic as well.
Yeah, sure. I'll try and weave all of that together. I mean, the first thing to say is I think if you look at a much longer perspective on government, you go back to Churchill and the role that Lord Cherwell played close to him. Science, it's interesting. It's always been one of these things that's, shall I say, a bit sexier for governments to sort of say it's like some superpower, you use that they're going to rely on. And even Harold Wilson talking about the white heat of technology, it's almost like they portray it as something that's going to solve the world's ills, and we're in a bit of danger of that at the moment with climate change, where somehow or other something's going to come over the horizon and that we can rely on and fix and so forth. And I think what's been fascinating, very difficult for government over the course of this pandemic, and also for the media, for the public, for organisations like us, is just getting back to that understanding of what science actually is. And there's often a conflation between the concept of science evidence and what actually we can put weight on that, and then science advice, where we've seen a very prominent role, not just for SAGE, but also for the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor, where they have a very difficult role to play. SAGE is a bit more removed in as much as it's a body that comes together and kind of summarises what the evidence can say and what we can conclude from that. But Whitty and Vallance have to go that stage further and have that conversation with the politicians, with ministers, with the Prime Minister about, okay, well, what do we do with that? And we've seen some very tricky moments where there just simply wasn't enough science evidence to be able to make a decision. Face masks at the beginning of the pandemic was a classic example where, the scientific advice was pushing towards, well, actually, we don't know that they make enough of a difference. And so the government went too far in that direction, and yet, the latter half of the sort of pandemic thus far, we ended up relying more and more on face masks. And similarly for behavioural science, that's been through a fascinating journey, because at times understanding what the public might do in the specific context of this virus, what it does, how it impacts people, what that means in terms of epidemiological impact, that's been something that they've had to almost work out in real time. Yes, there's been a certain amount of sort of resilience, work done in advance to try and understand how people react during a pandemic and so forth. But it became clear that some of those didn't necessarily hold true. So studies of what might happen in schools, if we close them all, is that going to help? Then when we open them up, how do we open them up? We were having to see people try to work this out in real time as we're going, and that makes it very difficult for decision making. So I think when we think about how government uses science and science evidence and science advice, we have to think about how well it understands the difference between the two, and how it's communicating that to the public, and whether they're understanding that actually there isn't the weight on this. And this is something that we pointed to in our report, about the idea of being led by the science versus being guided by the science, which are very different things. And there was a lot of frustration in the scientific community about the idea of being led by the science, as if somehow that will magically give you all the answers and you will have a pandemic solution here. So these are the sort of things that we talked about in our report, which is why we focus not just on the structures as they currently exist, but actually what Mark's referred to, the connectivity within government, how these different things add up. So it was things like the frameworks for decision making, how science is considered and weighed alongside other considerations, whether it's economic and social research, as well as policy and political decisions that actually aren't just based on that alone. The second was about setting out the basis for decisions. And this is something we've long looked at with Sense About Science, where we've talked about the evidence, transparency of policy making. And oftentimes you see policies just announced in a press release, and they don't necessarily say this is based on, this body of evidence. And that doesn't mean you need fully, footnoted, peer-reviewed journal articles behind every single policy decision. But what we ask with Sense About Science is, could just an average member of the public understand what led to this policy, what it's based on, what future analysis might go into seeing whether or not it actually does the thing that you're saying it's going to do? And during COVID, we saw some very variable experience of that. And then the second thing, it's been mentioned already today, is intelligent customers. So what do both ministers and also the civil service need in terms of induction, training, support, to actually understand how to use science well and to incorporate it with other kind of things? And then the final thing we talked about was red teaming. How do you make sure, especially when you have very limited information, that you're not following into sort of a pattern of behaviour, that you are actually questioning yourself? Because again, I've talked about evidence, I've talked about advice, there's also the methodology, the scientific methodology of, do we actually know that this is going to do the thing we think it's going to do? How can we test it robustly? How can we challenge ourselves and so forth? So that's kind of crucial to it.
Brilliant. And you've talked before about, if we look back at some of these past crises, foot and mouth, swine flu, actually a lot of the same problems occurred. You can look at the inquiries into those crises and see these issues come up time and time again. Why do you think they haven't been acted on? And do you have confidence, and I asked Greg this question, but do you have confidence this time might be a bit different?
I think the problem with the inquiry is by the time it happens, a lot of the changes will or will not have already occurred in Whitehall, and that is often the case with any kind of inquiries that looks into how government operated during a crisis. because the government does have to start learning lessons and moving on. And this is one of the reasons why we called for an interim lessons learned kind of discussion, just so that you could get those a bit more transparent, because we believe something must have been going on inside government, but whether that's individuals within government thinking, actually, I'll do this slightly differently, or whether it's something a bit more consistent, bringing it together, that's really important. But the other difficulty with this is, as much as we're talking about science, actually a lot of this is very basic human stuff. Ministers are under an awful lot of different pressures, some of which is literally, I've got to go on a press conference and I need some slides that work and that explain to people what the hell it is that we're doing. Some of it is just the pressure of time, exhaustion, situation where you've got a prime minister in intensive care with the very thing that you as a government are trying to fight against. So there's an awful lot of other things that make it difficult to just, when you sit back and look in retrospect, what it is that you should have done. But the other problem is that we are not as good as we could be in this country about following through with inquiries. Too often there isn't a clear sort of body who will then follow up with the inquiry and say, actually, have these been implemented? There was the Bichard review into the Soham murders was one where he said, actually, I'm coming back to see whether or not you've gone and implemented those. And we need similar now. So we've talked about Greg's committee and Parliament being some of the people who make sure that anything recommended in the inquiry is actually followed through, and keep asking those questions of government to make sure that that's followed through with.
I'm going to throw it open to questions. I'm just going to ask one more of my own, which is, Greg, I want to pick up this issue of the National Risk Register and the sort of Civil Contingency Secretariat. This is absolutely key when we think about future risks. And I think some of the analyses, certainly we looked at it, Alex Thomas there in the second row, found that some of these risks were identified, but they then weren't carried through into sort of operational planning, whether that was in hospitals or schools or whatever. I mean, have you got ideas on what you think needs to happen in that sort of risk planning, that sort of space?
So I strongly agree with Mark. I think it's an insurance perspective. The truth is that it's about spending money or people, human resource on things that may not happen. In fact, are probably very unlikely to happen. And the pressures in government are such that there's always day-to-day things that happen that are unexpected, that if you've got good people who are working on some kind of tail risk event, there's a temptation to say, right, that's all very well, but we need you to sort out fuel prices or whatever. That's always a temptation there. And when it comes to spending reviews, we've got one at the moment. If you've got operational cuts that you're faced with, it is understandable, but wrong to sacrifice those things that are about insuring against the future. I mean, it's the insurance problem. We all have a daily decision as to what we insure against and what we don't. But actually, quite often we do take out insurance, and quite often the state requires us to take out insurance. So it is possible to sort of override these instincts, but that's what we have to do. And in evidence to our inquiry, Oliver Letwin, who was the minister responsible for this during the Cameron government, spoke ruefully about how he had recruited and appointed a group of epidemiologists with particular infection in coronavirus type diseases, but they were, when he checked, what I described had happened. They'd been redeployed somewhere else in the last 2 or 3 years. So we need to organise to pay the insurance premiums.
Mark,
I mean, on that point specifically, I think one of the big challenges is that it's the departments that have the operational responsibility. So if you are in DHSC and you've got a waiting list, there's going to be an enormous amount of pressure to spend your money on that. The insurance policy is public health, and that's much harder to find money for. But it seems to me that actually, if you look at the levelling up agenda, an enormous part of that is actually about the public health of the nation. And one of the problems is that a lot of the levers for public health are actually held outside the Department of Health as well. They're about what makes places livable, they're about transport, they're about education. And an investment in education may yield a benefit in health 50 years later. And that's the big challenge. And so I think governments find it, and it's not just the UK government, I think governments across the world find it very difficult. And just one point on something Kath said, which is that the job of SAGE is actually to advise the GCSA and the CMO.
Yes.
So government is not there. I mean, there are observers from departments, but so that's the job of SAGE. But and I think something that scientists sometimes don't appreciate is that policymakers often have to make decisions in the face of uncertainty. That's life. You can't actually say to a minister, well, if you give us 5 years and not money, we'll find out more about coronavirus, by which time it's killed. So decisions always have to be made. And although coronavirus has been very, very difficult, Bob May, who had to deal with spongiform encephalopathy, that was seriously difficult because no one knew whether cattle, how it was transmitted, whether it would be transmitted. At least with coronavirus, it is a virus, and we know about that. The really big policy difficulty, I think, is that the fundamental principle of infection control is to keep people apart. But depriving people of their liberty does not come easily to policymakers. Some countries with different politics found it a lot easier to do. But I think that's been the issue. And of course, it turned out that people, certainly initially, were pretty happy to be locked down because they were pretty scared of the virus, with good cause, actually. And so a lot of the social science was learned as part of it. But I think it is the fact of the matter is that policymakers are always making decisions in the face of uncertainty. And when it comes to the Civil Contingency Secretariat, I think one of the challenges is a lot of what they do is on the securocrat side. And so it wasn't actually that it was secret what the membership of SAGE was, but it was never published. And so in my days, you were at liberty to say you were a member of SAGE, but it wasn't actually published. And I think that was a mistake, actually, and I think it's far better to publish the evidence, most of which actually comes from the public domain anyway, as soon as possible.
Okay, who would like to ask a question? If you can please say who you are, keep them short, and ensure that they are in fact questions. Yes, this was the first hand here, and then the lady with the red hair.
Richard.
It was in the corner, and then we'll come to you next.
Richard Slack, Emergent Biosolutions. We generate medical solutions to public health threats. And I will try and give a question, but it's a bit of an observation to which you might like to respond. The makeup of this panel, like the makeup of SAGE, and the discussion that you've had seems to me to be about a bilateral relationship between government and academia. But the real wins through the pandemic have been based on a trilateral relationship. And I think Patrick Vallance gets this through the public pandemic partnership. So my question is the private sector and industry missing from your discussion?
Great question. Okay, we'll take that one, and we'll take the lady there, and then we'll have a round of three.
Andrew Mackenzie from the Physiological Society. If science becomes more prominent in government and more front and centre of the decision-making in government, how do we stop it becoming more politicised? I think you obviously had Patrick Vallance stood next to the Prime Minister on several occasions, making perhaps rather dubious comments, and then sometimes choosing not to respond. And does that mean that he gets dragged into science? You had over the summer the Labour Party and the Conservative Party arguing two different approaches to the pandemic, both saying they were following the science. So how do you stop an inevitable dragging of scientists into politics?
Brilliant. I'll take one more.
Hi, thank you. Tara Austin, Ogilvy Behavioural Science Practice and the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group. So guess where I'm going with this one. The Imperial Centre for Psychedelic Research has led the world in the psychedelic renaissance. These medicines offer hope to millions of people in terms of the treatment of everything from depression to addiction. They offer hope for levelling up and much more besides. And yet we're seeing already a bit of a brain drain to America with Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris from Imperial off to San Francisco. And our academics, our leading researchers are chomping at the bit for the government, for the Home Office to reschedule these medicines, psilocybin. The scheduling of these medicines is holding up the research that needs to happen. And I want to ask the panel, how we can do this. This is arguably a moral question, a political question of the scheduling of what is perceived to be a drug, and yet in every possible context, as I can see in academia, it is a medicine and needs to be treated as such. How do we overcome this inertia?
Brilliant. Okay, Kath, I'll come to you first. Any of those, but particularly interested in whether you think it was a mistake for Valence to appear on the same, briefing as
yeah, it was something we sort of toyed with in lots of different directions. I mean, the problem is, I think I can understand the reasons why at the beginning it made sense, because there are certain questions that, you cannot have the chief scientific advisor and official answering. So not having a politician there at the same time means that you can't do that. But we did start to think that actually they should have been separate, doing sort of slightly separate press conferences to give a different flavour to it. I think some of that goes, though, to how these press conferences have evolved and whether or not they're sort of going to be a useful future innovation that we'll see more permanently used as a way of communicating with the public and avoiding lobby briefings. More generally, though, on politicisation of science, I mean, this is one of the reasons why we talk about the importance of evidence transparency, because I think it's the plainest language that you use to help the public understand this is what we're basing this on, helps them to or helps focus the mind of both politicians and the civil servants who are sort of writing this stuff out to think about, well, actually, what basis do we have for saying this? How can we back it up? How can we make sure that this is clear to the public, that actually there is, when we're saying it's based on evidence, that actually that's transparent and that is robust. But the other thing to say about that is I think this is why Parliament has such a crucial role, and there's been a lot done in the last 10 years to improve not just the way in which Parliament is scrutinising the use of science, but also parliamentary understanding of it. There's an organisation called Post-Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology. They've been doing a lot to work with parliamentarians to help them understand, to bring better connections to the academic community. I think it's a very interesting question about diversity in terms of the private sector, but I actually think there's another, dare I say it, diversity issue, which is about all sorts of other kind of diversity that needs to be there in the conversation, whether that's ethnicity, gender, or indeed, perspective on the world. There is always a danger of heavily Oxbridge or London-based perspective when you come to these kind of conversations. So I'm going to leave your question alone because I think that's more for the actual scientists. I'm a historian.
Do you want to pick up the drug research question and perhaps on the industry as well?
Yeah, let me start with the industry. I absolutely agree that that's a crucial part of how any tech sector is going to develop. And the obvious one was the vaccine manufacturing that was critically part of that in the pandemic. But I think it's also broadly true. Universities are good at exploring ideas, certainly not that great at scaling up and doing technical development. So it's crucial that you have different structures to that, and industry and private sector, I think, are a really good one. I mean, another side one we put on government is not just in terms of initial funding and policy and regulation, but also procurement. Clearly, when there's a market and you can drive the early stage of that market procurement, I think that makes a big difference as well. So fully support the hypothesis that you were sort of formulating there. In terms of the drugs, I'm not going to talk about the regulatory part of that, but let me just speak about you used the word brain drain. Look, mobility of people is really crucial to testing out good ideas. It's true, people go to the US, people come back from the US. I myself came back from the US. So I'm there is a point at which you're right, we might need to be concerned about it, but I'm not concerned about that at the moment, certainly not from the point of view of a place like Imperial. But I'll leave the regulatory part because that's a bit outside my domain for that.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Well, to Richard's point, I think one of the clear lessons of the pandemic response, particularly in vaccines, is the partnership between the NHS, universities, and research institutions, and the private sector. I mean, that is palpably the case. Mark mentioned the Vaccines Manufacturing Innovation Centre. That's come out of an arrangement that some people here will be familiar with, the Office of Life Sciences, which was very deliberately and full-heartedly looking to address the complementarity. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I was not far away here in Manchester. My committee met at the University of Manchester, and before we had our reform session, we visited one of the science parks here, which is right next to the hospital, and we were talking to clinicians in the hospital who were saying that some of the trials that are done by some of the commercial companies there, under the aegis of the university and the NHS, has meant a much quicker time to licensing and ability to understand the potential of new drugs and treatments, and so I think that is completely understood. When it comes to the kind of politicization of science, this goes back to what I was saying about being careful about thinking of there being some sole, uniform, objective scientific advice, and sometimes even evidence. I mean, I'm an economist, and the idea that any policymaker would say, well, we're doing this because we asked the economists, and this is what the economists have told us. You say, well, which economists? And where that people come from different schools of thought and have different views in it. And that is the same with science. You have people passionately arguing long before the spotlight was shone on them on the best way to proceed. So I don't think it's right to be kind of concerned that the purity of science is somehow being impugned by appearing on a kind of lectern in 10 Downing Street. And more than that, as it happens, and Mark is absolutely right in saying that the SAGE advises its chairs, the Chief Scientific Advisor, which Mark was, and the Chief Medical Officer, and it's they that give advice to government. But in our inquiry, we heard very explicitly and on the record that during the first phase of the pandemic, things were different later on, that the government followed the advice that they were being given by the CMO and the Chief Scientific Advisor in all material respects. So it's not as if being placed side by side was putting them in an invidious position. There was to all intents and purposes, an agreement about it. Now, I think that raises questions, and we touched on it a bit earlier, about challenge and the danger of, especially when there is a sense in which the kind of public might be spooked, the kind of pressures for uniformity and the possibility for people to challenge what seems to be the dominant view. So I fret more about the pressures on conformity, and what happened in that first wave, we now know, is that scientific advice, the civil service advice, and ministers all thought it was possible to kind of eke out the imposition of lockdown measures for longer than it proved wise. And there was almost a kind of simultaneous epiphany in which separately everyone realized this was the wrong course and we've got to change. Now, we did change, and Patrick Balance, the members of the committee, said that it came later than it could have done. And so one of the hard lessons we've got to learn is how, with all of our scientific brilliance, all of our deep, absolute commitment to public service and the values that go from that, both in the official side and in the scientific side, we did something that turned out not to be right. Now, the other thing to say about this is that it will often, in fact, it will be usually the case that in uncertainty you do things that turn out not to be right. And that's the point of learning the lessons, to see whether you could, there were things that you could have done, not to attach blame that someone fell down in their job, but what was it that led to that, so that you can act against it. And what's sometimes called a red team challenge is one such example.
Greg, just quickly on Richard's question. So Kate Bingham's sort of success with the Vaccines Task Force, being given real responsibility, yes, resources to an industry expert, that was notable in some sense because it's almost very, very unusual for Whitehall in the way it sort of typically behaves.
Yes.
Do you think there's sort of lessons from that?
I think there are lessons from it. I think it's absolutely right to convene all of the people literally in a room that can talk to each other, not send papers to each other, but thrash things out together. And reports that I pick up are that since Kate was there and running it, a bit of kind of normal Whitehall has started to creep back. Although the latest thing I hear is that the kind of the antibodies have detected this, and this has been recognised, and there's no pushback against that. But it makes the point that this is organic, and you can't think that you can just learn a lesson, set it up, and assume it'll be fine. You need to be forever vigilant.
Okay. Mark.
So, I mean, there is an agility that happens in wartime, and I mean, this is a sort of rather variant war, that everyone would like to retain, and there is no question that we did things faster and more efficiently at a much higher risk, and it would be nice to be able to retain some of that, but I think Greg is right. I think there is a sort of terrible danger of return to form. So we do need to be more agile. Industry was extensively involved, actually. Kate's already been mentioned, but the Formula One industry really dug in terms of helping with ventilators. Innovate UK funded the industry. So industry has been involved throughout this.
Should they be on stage, though?
If Sage, people are appointed not by virtue of the fact they are academic, but by virtue of the fact they have a specific expertise. I was just trying to instantly think, is there anyone that was from the business community on Sage? I don't think there was, but there are a lot of people with close connections. And Sage was very, very time consuming, I can tell you, that's the other thing. So I think industry is extremely important. I mean, on the politicization question, I actually think that Patrick and Chris handled it extremely well. And one of the things I was always aware of, because when you become the chief scientific advisor, you become a permanent secretary, and so you are subject to civil service code. I mean, it's as simple as that. And the job of civil servants is not to criticise their masters whilst they're in posting. It's as simple as that. And people would always get me, try and get me to criticise the government. And Patrick and Chris are not in a position to do that, but they have the privilege, as it were, of being able to talk to the most senior politicians, argue with them, present their case very strongly, but then it goes with the job that you then don't broadcast it through the media. And I was always aware that the second an advisor starts to broadcast to the government through the media, they have no influence whatsoever. I mean, it's lost overnight. And their job is not to be political. Their job is actually to give the evidence and recognise that at the end of the day, they're not elected. Greg and his colleagues are.
Just on that, Mark, so Neil Ferguson came out recently saying the CMO and GCSO role should be made more independent somehow. Do you think the balance is actually right?
Well, actually, historically, the CMO job is different. So the CMO is accountable to Parliament. It's a role that goes back to the 19th century and actually can't be sacked by ministers. The GCSA, on the other hand, which is a much more recent appointment, it goes back to Solly Zuckerman in the early 1960s in its present form, is a permanent secretary. So they actually do have a slightly different statutory relationship. And in fact, of course, Ian Diamond, as the national statistician, again has a sort of Chris Whitty-like constitutional position. On the psychedelic drug point, we have an advisory committee on the misuse of drug. It has an excellent range. It is a scientific advice committee. And after a rather well-known episode when one of the members left, was sacked, it was agreed that there would be a protocol that when the Home Secretary disagreed with the ACMD, they would actually write and explain, and that actually happened with respect to CAD. And so, I don't entirely accept your sort of very positive assertions about the power of psychedelic drugs. I think there are all sorts of scientific questions, but we have a perfectly good mechanism for looking at it, and it shouldn't be politicised.
Greg, you want to comment on
So just on the independence of Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, I think it's possible and would be wrong to kind of get caught up into the kind of paper descriptions of this. The idea that these two men of great eminence in their fields, both of them maintaining positions, in associations with research institutions and universities, both of them having, making income sacrifices, I dare say, to take the job. Certainly Patrick Vallance was on the board of GSK before. The idea that they would, and sort of leaving, that's their interest, leaving aside their motivation, which I know them, and they are palpably in it to do the right thing. So I don't think we should have in our minds at all that the fact that they are, as it were, on the government payroll compromises their independence. If they were being asked to do things that they thought was that were wrong and unethical, or even, frankly, just wrong and misguided to an appreciable degree, I'm absolutely certain that they would not do it, and they would not appear at the press conference, and they would say so themselves. So I don't think we should. We can be interested in the kind of structures on paper, but actually, I don't think it should trouble us in practice in this case.
Yes, actually, I never felt under any pressure at any point during my tenure of the GCSA role to, as it were, modulate my advice for the politics. Never. And I mean, the whole point of the GCSA and the CMO is to provide their advice. It won't necessarily be taken. I mean, I use the example of climate change. Some people don't like the policy implications, and so they try and get around the science. When it comes to the science, there shouldn't be any argument about that. It is what it is. But then there are a series of policy options, one of which is to do nothing about it. I don't think there's anyone in this room that would probably agree with that, I hope. But that is a policy option, and that's something that everyone has a say on, as it were, a vote. We all have a vote.
Okay. Kath, come back on that, and then I'll take another round of questions.
Yeah, just very briefly, and I thoroughly agree with that you were saying about Patrick and Chris. I think the point I was trying to make was not were they in danger of appearing too political, it's how to protect them from that. I mean, and it does worry me when you got to a position where Chris Whitty was getting abuse on the street. And I worry, therefore, about how future people will see that role. And so it's more about, is there more that we can do to protect that role, to make sure that the public are very aware of the boundaries, and also the broadcasters, so that they understand, of course, they're going to want to try and get a gotcha moment where they make one of them squirm. And I actually thought they handled a lot of that extremely well. But what can we do to make sure that people understand the difference between that and, you know, the role of the politicians, which is to answer for whatever it is that the government is doing?
Okay, let's have some more questions. Yeah, lady there, lady on the row there, and then in the red.
Hi, Ellie King from Warwick Manufacturing Group. It's a really interesting discussion, and I think one of the things that is involved in this that hasn't really been talked about is how the media communicates science to the general public, and the importance of like the public's understanding of what science is, and how we use science. So like, how does the media's role influence that? And is there anything any kind of thoughts on that, or anything that you think maybe could be done to improve that relationship?
Brilliant.
Rachel from Cancer Research UK. So my question's for you, Greg. It was really interesting to hear about you witnessing some research here in Manchester before sitting with your committee. And I wanted to ask about the importance, or if you think it's important to create time for research within the NHS, and whether or not you think that is actually sufficiently provided for at this point in time.
Hello there, Dr. Alexandra Trevelyan. So there's been fantastic science come out of the pandemic over the last 18 months, the vaccines, etc. However, one area that seems to be a bit shaky has been the modelling that has come out that doesn't always seem to be matching what actually occurs in real life. Have the models been too complex or too simple, or and how are we going to improve modelling to allow for better policy in the future?
Brilliant. I'm going to take actually one more question just at the back there. Yeah.
Hi, Susan Mitchell from Alzheimer's Research UK. My question was, what are the future challenges we should be preparing for now?
Lovely. Thank you. Ian, I'm going to start with you. Could you pick up the one on the media and then any others you wanted to comment on?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's clear that we need better ways to articulate science in an intelligible way so that the public can understand it. And I think from the university perspective, it's partly about understanding how we engage and work with our academics to make that possible. Most grants now, and again, Mark and his UKRI role will be able to say more too, include that kind of challenge as an explicit challenge. There's a lot of work about responsible research and innovation, which I think is rightly getting more prominence now, that will help in that discourse. We have, I mentioned mentioned our science communication master's course. I think that's the critical kind of thing, to be an interlocutor between the science and the public. So I do think that's a crucial part. I think during the pandemic, the people who've appeared on TV that have been compelling in that articulation have made really great inroads into models for how we take that forward.
Greg, Rachel's question on NHS research, and then anything on the others.
So I completely agree with Rachel, and it's kind of linked to this insurance point that, of course, there are pressures to cut the time for research, but it is absolutely vital. And Mark made the point of the foundations of Sarah Gilbert's work that were built on to be able to come up with the vaccine so quickly. So it is very important, and we need to protect and defend that. I completely agree with that. To Aileen's point on communication, it was mentioned, I think, some time earlier about the Science Media Centre, who I find do an excellent job, and their approach is usually, as people here might know, is to bring together a number of different experts and put them in front of the press, either on the record or off the record. So you can have different perspectives and sustained questioning. And that's kind of what we've done on the committee, and it's one of the reasons why I think people have tuned in, because people are interested in seriousness and can see that, although I think the Downing Street press conferences were a kind of valuable thing, you've got one question, great effort to kind of sneak in a second question on the back of it, but that was it. And it's the same, frankly, in the House of Commons, I'm afraid, at the dispatch box. You get a question to the Minister or to the Secretary of State, and you don't get a chance to follow it up and to question the answer. So that kind of approach, I think there is an appetite for it on the part of the public, and we should indulge it. Eddie, you mentioned you're from WMG, the Warwick Manufacturing Group. One of the eye-opening things of bringing the committee to the University of Manchester and poking our nose in some labs and see what's going on is that, as we all know, it does make a difference to kind of see rather than just read about things. And actually, a lot of what is done in science and technology, for that matter, is not seen. Perhaps the final products are. And I think, obviously some things have to be totally secure, but I think to get more people onto campuses and to have tools. One of the things I did a couple of years ago when I was in Munich was to go around the BMW manufacturing plants, not just technology rather than science. But they've arranged it, and they do it in Japan. I've been on the Toyota plant in Japan. They have kind of walkways that snake their way around the production line, so you can look down, you can see what a modern automated facility is. And I took my kids with me on holiday in Bavaria. And actually, I'm sure that sort of is implanted in their minds, obviously not a knowledge about technology, but a kind of an image of it that you can't just get from textbooks. So I would encourage WMG and other people to, however inconvenient and disruptive, to try and have the public in for tours, things to watch there.
Mark, I feel you might be best equipped to be the clairvoyant on the panel and look at the future challenges, and then also any comment on the modelling question.
Yeah, sure. I will actually just say something on broadcasting, because actually, or the media, I think it's actually been extraordinarily good, actually. The vast majority of the journalists have worked really hard to try and be accurate. The accuracy of the BBC reporting has been exceptional, and other channels as well. I think one of the difficulties is that if you're on a broadcast interview, the shortage of time means it's very, very hard to do nuance. And I think that is a problem, and there's no easy solution to that. On the modelling, I couldn't disagree with you more, actually. The modelling has been extraordinary. But models don't make predictions. Models can give you projections, and if you look at all of the models, they've always been bounded by variability, by uncertainty. And of course, one of the things that models have helped policymakers to do is to do things to stop the predictions happening. And so if a model said there could be up to X cases, and there aren't that may well be because of the intervention. the models are inevitably too simple because we're dealing with very complex phenomena, and the modelling gets better over time because it depends on understanding the virus, understanding how it reproduces, all sorts of things. But actually the modelling has been very, very powerful, and modellers don't do predictions. They do scenarios, they do projections, but they don't predict. So I would defend the models, actually. I think it's been one of the strengths, and actually the UK is world leading in modelling. On the future challenges, well, there's pestilence, there's famine, there's plague. But to be serious, I think that, well, I am serious in the sense that, we're not done with infectious disease, I'm afraid. But I think our infrastructure is an area where I think we have to worry. It goes back to the efficiency resilience question. We are now critically dependent on the internet in ways we weren't before. We haven't had full-blown cyber war, but there's a level of cyber conflict going on all the time. And we have got fairly aging infrastructure. So I think there's a lot of potential, and we see cascading failures, as I said right at the beginning. So I think there could be quite a lot of challenges there. And then there is the obvious challenges that come with climate and waste. So unfortunately, I think there are a lot of challenges, and there are a lot of people on the planet, and it makes it quite difficult.
Greg, you want to come back on that, and then I'll come to Kath.
Yeah, just on the modelling thing. So I think there has been too much of a tendency to have kind of point estimates that have been seized on out of models, which is not the fault of the modelers. I think it's a symptom of what Mark describes as the nuance being lost in a broadcast interview, and suddenly we're predicting 50,000 deaths or whatever. We took extensive evidence on this in most disciplines, including epidemiology. The point of a model is not actually to come up with an estimate; it's to consider, as it were, the kind of the mechanics of the forces that are shaping it. But I do think that the prominence of modelling numbers has not reflected that nuance, and that is a concern. And I think we ought to try and learn a lesson for this. I would say that the Bank of England, for example, tends to be a bit better when it, and the Office of Budget Responsibility, when it gives its forward forecast. It has what they call a fan chart of different outcomes, and they're always very reluctant to articulate a particular number. They say, look at the fan chart, and a lesson to be learned is perhaps not to crystallise it into a single number that then becomes the definitive number. And if it doesn't transpire to be correct, and how could it be, then this is seen to be a kind of a failure of the model, when actually it might be totally consistent with the spread of outcomes predicted.
Kath, you want to come in on that and how models are communicated?
Yeah, well, actually, I wanted to tie up several of these questions. The one about communication of science, this point about modelling, and then also the question about future challenges. Because actually, I think for all we talked about the inquiry and lessons learned and so forth, the big lessons for us, there are going to be some very important ones for government, for structures of government, for ministers, etc. But actually, the big lessons are going to be ones that we need social scientists now to work on, which is, how has the pandemic affected the public's understanding of these kind of future challenges and what that might mean for us, or indeed has it even affected us? Has it changed the way in which we conceive of government, the desire for certainty over modelling of what is happening, what is going to happen, the way in which it may or may not have changed the way it wants government to communicate with it about sort of science and the risks and so forth. And I mean, going to Mark's point about infrastructure and cyber and so forth, I'm sure many of us here were affected by the WhatsApp outage yesterday, which we can all laugh and joke about it and so forth, but it is a reminder that stuff like that goes down, and we're all like, what do we do? How do we cope? So there's some big questions for us about how the public can cope with some of these future challenges and what lessons we can take from the pandemic. But a completely non-scientific final observation as a historian, the feeling you always get is the next thing that's going to happen is going to be some twist on whatever's happened before. So it will be very hard for us to actually predict, because it will be something random we just couldn't conceive.
Okay, we've got time for one last question. It went up very quickly over there. Yeah, we'll take that and then we'll wrap up.
Andrew Will, Altrincham Sale West. I've been a chartered engineer for 40 years, so my sympathy is with science. However, am I sympathetic with science? Absolutely not. My concern with science is highlighted with COVID. It's the climate change argument. It's also the concern with, say, the dietary advice. I won't mention the first two, but how would you prevent cock-ups, scientific cock-ups that have already and can have the potential to negatively affect millions? I'll give an example. The first scientific advice on diet was issued in 1961 by Ansel Keys in the States, based on his diet heart hypothesis. Scientists at the time were not in full agreement. Those who disagreed were driven out of the industry. They were ostracized and ignored, belittled. Large studies were conducted after the advice was given. The advice was given with no prior tested and no prior knowledge of studies. They were based on assumptions. The information in those studies that didn't agree with the hypothesis was ignored. It was found 40 years later in a basement, magnetic tapes with data on 40 years afterwards, that completely contradicted the policy given. And there was a letter in the BMJ in 2016, I think, that covered that. But basically, how do you prevent cock-ups? And if scientists can't look at themselves and accept that they have human weaknesses of arrogance, overconfidence, etc., then we're going to lose trust of the population.
Okay, thank you. Mark, I'm going to come to you first on cock-ups.
Yeah, scientists are humans, and a bit like MPs, there are some that are good and there are some that are less good. It is as simple as that. But it is actually part of the value system of science, and it's very much part of the education that there is a rigor in the process, and because actually science, it doesn't accrete in single steps, it accretes in small bits of evidence, and so it is a sort of self-confirming or self-refuting ultimately, and so the truth does eventually out. Diet has been a very difficult area, actually. I think it's difficult to do good dietary studies, and I think that there hasn't been rigor in some of them. So I think we know generally that obesity tends to be an unhealthy condition, and actually being undernourished is unhealthy as well. And that controlling calories is very important, but there is a lot of faddery as well as science in diet. But drugs such as statins have actually been extremely powerful in terms of reducing coronary artery disease. So, scientists are not on a pedestal, but by and large, it is part of the training that you do things rigorously. It is the power of the experimental approach,
Thank you. I would endorse what Marcus said. I think one has to distinguish between the natural uncertainty of scientific progression until one can reach a conclusion. Some areas are more amenable to that than others. We have a structure for space-time and curved space in general relativity that I think everybody agrees is right. I think there are other areas where it's much harder to come to a single conclusion about what truth is. I would distinguish that from the lack of integrity in research. That's the bad scientist to which Mark refers. There, I think it's both rigor in training and oversight, both in research that's done in individual laboratories and then the wider review system, followed by reproducibility. And we have to hold ourselves to account as scientists in order to ensure that the latter does not occur. But the former part will always be there, and we just need to understand how we are going to use that to inform policy and other decisions based on the inherent uncertainty in some of those areas.
Last word from you, Greg.
Thank you. Well, in all circumstances, there are going to be times in which you're operating under uncertainty and you'll make the wrong call based on all the best information you had, all the best learning that you had, synthesized in a high-minded way, but it's only in practice that turns out to be wrong. And we must we must understand that that's inevitable, just as it is in other walks of life. No one in business would regard any kind of business setback, whether it's a company or a marketing campaign, as being an indication that they were kind of worthless as a potential businessman or woman. In fact, many of them have gone on to learn important lessons and to prosper from that. And I don't think science is exempt from that. But we should reflect on what are the things that can force learning, sometimes uncomfortable. We've talked about transparency. I think for people to know what the basis of statements and advice is important. As Ian said, reproducibility. My committee's next inquiry will be into reproducibility, the question of whether it is possible for someone other than the researcher that wrote a paper to take the same data or comparable data and find the same results. And it seems to me that it ought to, part of the standards ought to be that it's possible to do that. So we should do that. But as Mark said, everyone is human, and it can be uncomfortable to have your views challenged to the point of sometimes being replaced. The classic work on this, probably many people in this room know, is The Structure of Scientific Revolutions that Thomas Kuhn wrote in the 1950s, would it be, Mark? Which describes just the kind of birth pangs of when you move from one way of seeing the world to another, and the institutional forces and the kind of forces in the brain that throw up resistance to that. So it's not new. It's not a new sin of the kind of 2020s. It's something that has occupied scientific thinkers and more for many years. And what Kuhn described was really writing down what I'm sure had been thought for many hundreds of years before that.
Okay. Thank you to my panel. We're going to leave it there. Please do grab a sandwich or a cup of tea or something on the way out. Quick parish notice, we've got another IFG event in just over an hour in this room on decarbonising homes. Next door, Exchange 1. Thank you, Penny. Please do join us for that if you would like to. We've got Lord Callanan from the business department, among others. All that remains for me is to thank again our sponsors, Royal Society and Imperial College London. Thank you very much for all of your questions, and thank you to my brilliant panel for a really engaging conversation.